We're using a somewhat innovative presentation format for today's presentations. If you're not familiar with it, it looks like Pecha Kucha. It is pronounced Pechakucha, and it is a Japanese term that means chit-chat. Our goal here is to provide as many focused projects, or to spotlight as many focused projects here in Vermont underway, focused on this goal of Vermont independence as we can today, in the short time that we have together. We're very glad you're all here. Welcome again to the Vermont State House, to the People's House. I'm just curious, do we have anyone from out of state? Fantastic. Your hands are up. Where are you all from? Connecticut. Welcome. Anyone else?
New Hampshire.
Free Grafton. How many New Hampshireites do we have? Fantastic. Any other Connecticutites? Connecticuters? Great. Anyone else from out of state?
Massachusetts.
New Jersey.
Wow.
New York.
New York. Excellent. Well, to all of our New England and Northeast friends who have traveled far to be here today, we're glad you're here. Welcome to the Vermont State House, and we're going to get things rolling here. We have just a couple of house cleaning items. The bathrooms are outside and around to the right. The dining hall is also around to the right, and they will be serving lunch today from noon to 1:15. You're also welcome to bring your own if you did, or head downtown for lunch. We'd like to extend a special thank you to the Vermont State House staff for making us feel welcome, particularly Francis Brooks, who's the Sergeant at Arms here, and to Duncan Goss, who's in charge of TAP. So thanks to all of them for supporting us and having this conversation here at the State House today. And now we begin with our first keynote address. Please welcome all the way from Mexico, innovative cultural historian and social critic Morris Berman, whose numerous books on U.S. history, culture, and politics have provided his readers with insights into a more resilient future. In his new book, Why the U.S. Failed, The Roots of Imperial Decline, Morris Berman wrote the following: Vermont independence is a fascinating possibility. The once and future of the Republic of Vermont, Morris Berman.
Thanks, Rob, and thank all of you for coming here today. I want to thank the Second Vermont Republic for making it possible for me to be here today, especially my friend Tom Naylor for the invitation. I did write, as Rob mentioned, a series of, this is actually a trilogy of books on the decline of the American Empire. Started in 2000 with a book called The Twilight of American Culture. Then there was Dark Ages America. And about a year ago, Why America Failed. There was also a collection of essays, half of which were dedicated to the subject, called The Question of Values. All these focus specifically on the collapse of the United States. Today, I actually want to talk about a larger context. That is to say, the collapse of the United States is nested within the collapse of capitalism in general, which I think we're living out today, which is what we're seeing today. And that's the subject I really want to address today. Hence the title of this talk, La Longue Durée, The Long Run. Even then, the collapse of capitalism is nested within an even larger collapse, and that's the end of modernity itself, which we're also living through. I won't say much about that, a little bit at the end. As I said, I want to focus on the second tier, which is the collapse of capitalism. Just so we know what we're really talking about, I'm going to be talking about the macrocosm. I've done this vastos, as we say in Spanish, the broad strokes. But I think it's important just to have a glimpse at the microcosm, to know what it is we're really talking about, what this thing looks like. A short while ago, a very wealthy Mexican CEO, died. I happen to know a lot of inside information quite by accident. That is to say, I'm very close friends with somebody who was in his inner circle. It's quite an accident. I don't travel in these exalted circles, and so it's just by accident that I happen to know this stuff. I can't tell you what this company manufactured, because then you could Google it and figure out what you're talking about. So I'm going to say that he manufactured enchiladas. Okay? He didn't, but let's just call it a big enchilada. Kind of interesting to get a close look at it. Senor Enchilada died with a personal wealth of $10 billion. This was outside of the holdings he actually had in the corporation. Personal wealth, in the bank, in his name, $10 billion. Why any one individual would need $10 billion kind of escapes me, but that's what he died with. His kids hated his guts. His son wouldn't show up at the funeral, and the kids are now clawing each other's eyes out to get the will rearranged so that each of them can get the largest share. That, after all, was the only value we talked about. My friend told me that in the course of his career, if any little company wanted to start manufacturing enchiladas, say some Hispanic couple in LA, wanted to open some little manufacturer to make enchiladas, he would contact the Board of Health of that section of LA and see to it that they killed the company. So they couldn't make a few $1,000s off of enchiladas so that he could die with $10 billion. I guess nobody told him you can't take it with you. I think he believed you could. 3 days before he died, he said to my friend, you know, we really have to move on Africa. We really have to start marketing in a major way enchiladas in Africa. This was not a version of the death of Ivan Illich by Tolstoy, where Ivan Illich spends his last few days reflecting over the meaninglessness of his life. Oh no, not at all. This was, how can we move on Africa? The guy knew only one word his entire life, mas, more. That's all he knew. And when you put all that together and look at the horror and the damage on the human level that capitalism looks like, on the micro level, it's quite depressing. It's quite terrifying. I'm going to talk, as I said, in terms of the macrocosm, but I think it's important to understand what lies underneath that face. The story I just gave you could probably be multiplied thousands of times. It's happening all the time. So everybody thought the Don, as he was called, was a great hero. President Calderon would take him to state visits in other countries and so on. But the inner life of the Don was miserable. And it's important to keep that in mind, how we define success. Anyway, just a little background about that. So, the longue durée, the long run. This was an expression made popular by the Annales School of French historians, led by Fernand Braudel, who coined the phrase in 1958. The basic argument of the Annales School is that the proper concern of historians should be the analysis of structures that lie at the base of contemporary events. Underneath short-term events, such as individual cycles of economic boom and bust, said Braudel, we can discern the persistence of, quote, old attitudes of thought and action, resistant frameworks dying hard, at times against all logic. An important derivative of the Annales School is the work of the World Systems Analysis School, including Emmanuel Wallerstein in the United States and Christopher J. Stone in Great Britain, which similarly focuses on long-term structures, in particular capitalism. The arc of capitalism, according to this school, is about 600 years long, from 1500 to 2100. It's our particular fortune, probably misfortune would be more accurate, to be living through the beginning of the end. The disintegration of capitalism as a world system. It was mostly commercial capital in the 16th century, evolving into industrial capital in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then moving on to financial capital, which is money created by money itself, and by speculation in currency, for example, in the 20th and 21st. In dialectical fashion, it will be the very success of the system that eventually does it in. The last time a change of this magnitude occurred was during the 14th and 15th centuries, during which time the medieval world began to come apart and be replaced by the modern one. In his classic study of the period, The Waning of the Middle Ages, the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga depicted the time as one of depression and cultural exhaustion, like our own age, not that much fun to live through. One reason for this is that the world is literally pushed over an abyss. What lies ahead is largely unknown, and to have to hover over an abyss for a long time is, to put colloquially, a bit of a drag. The same thing was true at the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire, on the ruins of which the feudal system slowly arose. I was musing on these issues some time ago when I happened to run across a remarkable essay by Naomi Klein. I'm guessing most of you have heard of her or read her work, The Shock Doctrine, for example. The essay was called Capitalism versus the Climate. It was published in The Nation last November. In what appears to be something of a radical shift for her, she chastises the left for not understanding what the right does correctly perceive, that the whole climate change debate is a serious threat to capitalism. The left, she says, wants to soft pedal the implications. It wants to say that environmental protection is compatible with economic growth, that it's not a threat to capital or labor. It wants to get everyone to buy a hybrid car, for example, which I personally compared in my writings to eating a diet cheesecake. It wants us to use more efficient light bulbs or recycle, as though these things were adequate to the crisis at hand. But the right is not fooled. It sees green as a Trojan horse for the red. The attempt to abolish capitalism and replace it with some kind of eco-socialism. It believes correctly that the politics of global warming is inevitably an attack on the American dream, on the whole capitalist structure. So Larry Bell, in his book Climate of Corruption, argues that environmental politics is essentially about, quote, transforming the American way of life in the interests of global wealth distribution. And the British writer James Delingpole notes that modern environmentalism successfully advances many of the causes dear to the left: redistribution of wealth, higher taxes, greater government intervention, regulation. What Naomi Klein is saying to the left, in effect, is, why fight? These nervous nellies on the right are right. Those of us on the left can't keep talking about compatibility of limits to growth and unrestrained greed, or claiming that climate change is just one issue on the laundry list of worthy causes vying for progressive attention, or urging everyone to buy a Prius. Commentators like Thomas Friedman or Al Gore, who assure us that we can avert catastrophe by buying green products and creating clever market products and pollution or whatever, corporate green capitalism, in a word, are simply living in denial. I don't know if you guys ever saw it. One of the early seasons of the sitcom 30 Rock by Tina Fey. You can probably download this and screen it on your computer. But the episode was called Green Zone. Man, it's really hilarious. The Alec Baldwin character says to the Tina Fey character, guess what? NBC is going green. And do you know why? And she says, to save the earth. He says, no, to drain it of its remaining resources. And then Green Zone, who's, a green outfit, he's got a cape, and he's running around. It's played by David Schwimmer. He comes out with slogans like saving the earth while promoting corporate profitability. Diet cheesecake. Anyway, it's quite funny. I really urge you to take a look at it. The solutions to the climate crisis, Klein writes, are also our best hope of building a much more enlightened economic system. one that closes deep inequalities, strengthens and transforms the public sphere, generates plentiful, dignified work, and radically reins in corporate power. In one of the essays in my book, A Question of Values, it's the essay called Conspiracy versus Conspiracy in American History. I lay out some of the unconscious programs buried in the American psyche from our earliest days, programs that account for most of America's so-called conscious behavior. These include the notion of an endless frontier, a world without limits, and the ideal of extreme individualism. You do not need and should not need anyone's help to, quote, make it in the world. Combined, the two of these provide a formula for enormous capitalist power and inevitable capitalist collapse. Of this, Naomi Klein writes, "The expansionist, extractive mindset, which has so long governed our relationship with nature, is what the climate crisis calls into question so fundamentally. The abundance of scientific research showing we have pushed nature beyond its limits does not just demand green products and market-based solutions, it demands a new civilizational paradigm, one grounded not in dominance over nature, but respect for natural cycles of renewal, and acutely sensitive to natural limits. These are profoundly challenging revelations for all of us raised in Enlightenment ideals of progress." I have to say this is exactly what I argued 31 years ago in a book I called The Reenchantment of the World. It's nice to see it coming around again. Real climate solutions, she continues, are ones that steer government interventions to systematically disperse and devolve power and control to the community level, though through community-controlled renewable energy, local organic agriculture, or transit systems genuinely accountable to their users. Hence, she concludes, the powers that be have reason to be afraid, and to deny the data on global warming, because what is really part of this, at this point, is the end of the free market ideology. And I would add the end of the art of capitalism I referred to a moment ago. It's going to be a colossal fight. It is a colossal fight. Not only because the powers that be want to hang on to their power, but because the art and all its ramifications have given that class meaning with a capital M for more than 500 years. This is what the Occupy Wall Street protesters, if there are any left at this point, I'm not sure, need to tell the 1%. Your lives are at stake. This is what a new civilizational paradigm finally means. But it also has to be said that almost everyone in the United States, not just the upper 1%, buys into this. John Steinbeck pointed this out many years ago when he wrote that in the United States, the poor regard themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. You know, my ship is coming in next year, right? The Occupy movement, as far as I can make out, wanted to restore the American dream, when in fact, the dream needs to be abolished once and for all. Naomi then provides us with a list of 6 changes that must occur for this new paradigm to come into being, including reining in corporations, ending the cult of shopping, and taxing the rich. I found myself at this point writing good luck in the margins of the article. These things are not going to happen. And what we probably need instead of discussing how these are going to happen is a series of major conferences on why they won't happen. In fact, Montpelier would be an excellent place to hold such a series. But I have to note that part of the answer is already embedded in her essay. Vested interests, in both the economic and psychological sense, have every reason to maintain the status quo. And as I said, so does the man or woman in the street. What would our lives be like without shopping, without the latest technological tool? Pretty empty, at least in the U.S. And it seems to me how awful it is that capitalism has reduced human beings to this. In terms of recommendations, then, Klein's essay is rather weak, but it offers something very important by way of analysis, and also by implication, that everything is related to everything else. Psychology, the economy, the environmental crisis, our daily mode of living, the dumbing down of America, the pathetic fetish over cell phones and electronic gadgets, the crushing debt of student loans, the farce of electoral politics, Ron Higby's haircut, Mr. Obama's rather rapid conversion from liberal hero to war criminal and shredder of the Bill of Rights, the huge popularity of violent movies, the attempt of the rich to impose austerity measures on the poor, as you see going on in Europe, the well-documented epidemics of mental illness and obesity in this country, these are not separate spheres of human activity. They are interconnected. And this means that things will not get, fixed piecemeal. New civilizational paradigm means it's all or nothing. There really is no in-between. There's no diet cheesecake out there to be had. As Klein says, it's not about single issues anymore. What then can we expect as the art of capitalism comes to a close? This is where Naomi shifts from unlikely recommendations to hard-nosed reality. She writes, "The corporate quest for scarce resources will become more rapacious and more violent. Arable land in Africa will continue to be grabbed to provide food and fuel to wealthier nations. Drought and famine will continue to be used as a pretext to push genetically modified seeds, driving farmers further into debt. We will attempt to transcend peak oil and gas by using increasingly risky technologies to extract the last drops, turning ever larger swaths of our globe into sacrifice zones. We will fortress our borders and intervene in foreign conflicts over resources, or start those conflicts ourselves. Free market climate solutions, as they're called, will be a magnet for speculation, fraud, and crony capitalism, as we are already seeing with carbon trading and the use of forests as carbon offsets. And as climate change begins to affect not just the poor, but the wealthy as well, we will increasingly look for techno fixes to turn down the temperature, with massive and unknowable risks. As the world warms, the reigning ideology tells us it's everyone for themselves, that victims deserve their fate, and that we can master nature will take us to a very cold place indeed." End of quote. To put it bluntly, the scale of change required cannot happen without a massive implosion of the current system. This was true at the end of the Roman Empire, it was true at the end of the Middle Ages, and it's true today. In the case of the Roman Empire, as I discussed in the first book in the series, The Twilight of American Culture, there was the emergence of monastic orders which began to preserve the treasures of Greco-Roman civilization. My question in that book was, can something similar happen today? Naomi writes, "The only wild card is whether some countervailing popular movement will step up to provide a viable alternative to this grim future. This means not just an alternative set of policy proposals, but an alternative worldview to rival the one at the heart of the ecological crisis, this time embedded in interdependence rather than hyper-individualism, reciprocity rather than dominance, and cooperation rather than hierarchy. She believes that the Occupy Wall Street movement, remember, it was quite vigorous last November, embodies this, that they've taken aim at the underlying values of rampant greed and individualism that created the economic crisis, while embodying radically different ways to treat one another and relate to the natural world." Well, is this true? 4 things to consider at this point. 1, I personally never visited Zuccotti Park, but most of what I saw on the web, including very favorable reportage of the Occupy movement, seemed to suggest that the goal was a more equitable American dream, not the abolition of the American dream, as I indicated a moment ago. In other words, the basic demand was that the pie be cut off more fairly. I never had the impression that the protesters were saying that the pie in toto was rotten. This reminds me of an anecdote told about Martin Luther King. I don't really know if it's true, floats around, that King apparently said to Harry Belafonte just before he was assassinated, that is King, not Belafonte, that he thought he might have been making a big mistake, that he sometimes felt like he was herding people into a burning church. This is a very different insight than the notion that black people should be getting a larger share of the pie. After all, who wants a larger share of a rotten pie? Or to live in a church that's burning down? Secondly, the anal historians, along with the world systems analysis thinkers, have been accused of projecting an image of history without people. In other words, these schools tend to see individuals as somehow irrelevant to the historical process, which they analyze in terms of historical forces. And there's some truth to this, but historical forces can become a bit mystical. Just as it is forces that motivate people, so it is people that enact or manifest those forces. I mean, someone has to do something for history to occur. And at least the Occupy crowd was trying to throw sand on the wheels of the machine, so to speak, as did their counterparts in Europe. But I confess that for a number of reasons, I was never very optimistic about the movement, at least not as it existed in the United States. As many sociologists have pointed out, America has no real socialist tradition. And it is no surprise that the serious maldistribution of wealth that exists in the U.S. today is no issue whatsoever in the forthcoming American presidential election. In fact, a recent poll by the Pew Charitable Trust revealed that most Americans have no problem at all with the existence of small wealthy class. They just want to be able to join them. And this takes us back to the quote from Steinbeck. They're all temporarily embarrassed millionaires waiting for their ship to come. My own prediction several months ago was that the Occupy movement would turn into a kind of permanent teaching, where the disaffected could go to learn about a new civilization paradigm if that would indeed be taught. This is basically what I call the new monastic option and the twilight of American culture. On one level, it's probably innocuous. It hardly threatens the power elite. But that may not be the whole story, especially in the long run, la longue durée. After all, as the system collapses, alternatives are going to become increasingly attractive. And you can be sure that 2008 is not the last crash we're going to live through by a long shot. The two sides go hand in hand, and ultimately, I'm talking 30 to 40 years, but who knows, maybe less, the weight of the arc of capitalism will be too onerous to sustain itself. In the long run, one is far smarter betting on the alternative worldview than on capitalism. Thus, the biologist David Ehrenfeld writes, our first task is to create a shadow economic, social, and even technological structure that will be ready to take over as the existing system fails. I take it we're going to hear more about such shadow structures as they progress, and I'm looking forward to it. Point 3. What then is that alternative worldview, that new civilizational paradigm? In Why America Failed, I lay out, unsurprisingly enough, the reasons for why America failed. Duh. And I say this primarily because throughout our history, we marginalized or ignored the voices that argued against the dominant culture, which is based on hustle and aggrandizement and economic and technological expansion. The alternative tradition can be traced from John Smith in 1616 to Jimmy Carter in 1979, and it included folks such as Emerson, Thoreau, Lewis Mumford, Jane Jacobs, Vance Packard, John Kenneth Galbraith, among many others. In England, it is particularly associated with John Ruskin and William Morris, who argued for the need for organic communities with a spiritual purpose, for work that was meaningful rather than mind-numbing, and, I have to say, they did manage to acquire a large number of American disciples. In a forthcoming book by a colleague of mine, Joe Magnuson, entitled The Approaching Great Transformation, it will be out in March from 7 Stories Press, by the way. The author states that we need concrete models of a post-carbon economy, ones that break with the profit model of capitalism, and not in cosmetic or rhetorical ways. In other words, we are not talking Ben and Jerry's ice cream. Okay. He gives a number of examples of experiments in this vein, ones that I would call elements of a steady state or homeostatic economy, no growth, in other words. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, he and I have gone back in emails about analyzing various movements that emerge. And most of them, not always, but most of them, if you read the fine print, it's still about technological innovation and economic expansion. Regardless of how cool the green zone rhetoric is, it's still capitalism. I mean, there are lots of examples of this around, as Joe and I found. One of the most hilarious ones, I recently clipped this little ad from The Nation about a conference on sustainable investing, and it's great. Make money and make a difference. Capitalism for a democratic society. Money talks, tell it to change the world. Of course, sponsored by Deep Pockets Chocolate. And, his ilk. And by the way, if you